What if everything you thought you knew about Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner's tragic deaths was wrong? What if the story that gripped headlines, flooded social media feeds, and haunted the public imagination for weeks was only the surface of something far darker, far more chaotic? Imagine walking into your own home and finding the people you trusted most, your parents, the ones who gave you life, murdered. And the person everyone assumed would be safe with you, the family you loved, becomes the prime suspect. This isn't just a headline. This isn't a fleeting story to scroll past on your phone. This is a shocking, real-life unraveling of a family at the heart of fame, fortune, and tragedy. And at the center of it all is Nick Reiner, son of Rob and Michelle, whose voice now finally cuts through the speculation, revealing a night that, by his own words, was chaos. Nothing happened the way people think. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. It all began in Brentwood, Los Angeles, on a seemingly ordinary Sunday, December 14th. The Reiners' estate, worth an astonishing $13.5 million, loomed like a fortress of wealth, prestige, and carefully curated appearances. Inside, however, the walls held secrets far more sinister than any outsider could have imagined. Rob Reiner, celebrated director and actor, was 78. Michelle, his wife, was 70. Together, they had cultivated a life that looked perfect from the outside. Success, stability, a family bound by love, or so the world believed. But when the police were called to the estate that night, they found something no one could have predicted. Rob and Michelle, stabbed to death in what authorities immediately declared a homicide. And the person who would shock the world by being arrested in connection to these deaths was none other than Nick Reiner, 32, their son, living in the guest house on the property. You might think you know how this story unfolds. A troubled adult child, a moment of rage, a family destroyed. That's what the early reports suggested. But Nick Reiner's statement, the first real insight from him since that fateful night, turns everything upside down. That night was chaos. Nothing happened the way people think, he said. Those words are simple, yet their implications are staggering. They hint at confusion, fear, and events so unpredictable that even the people who lived through them could barely piece together the sequence of what happened. And as the story begins to unfold, one question keeps surfacing. How could a night that started like any other spiral into such tragedy? Before we go further, let's take a moment to consider the human element here. Families aren't just names on social media or characters in Hollywood gossip. They are complex systems of emotions, loyalties, grievances, and hidden tensions. Rob and Michelle had more than their share of success. They had children who loved them, connections that extended through Hollywood circles, and lives that, from the outside, seemed unshakable. But inside that gilded Brentwood estate, pressures and conflicts were simmering. Romy Reiner, their 27-year-old daughter, reportedly discovered the bodies that night and immediately told authorities about a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. That family member, of course, was Nick. Romy's quick thinking, her horror at the scene, and her knowledge of hidden dynamics in the household would become pivotal in shaping how investigators interpreted the night. Yet even her account leaves gaps and contradictions. Some details didn't align with what the police expected. Some details would not be revealed for weeks, even months, leaving a chilling vacuum of uncertainty. And then there's the nature of the deaths themselves. Multiple sharp force injuries, a manner of death officially ruled homicide. The brutality is jarring, but so too is the confusion over timing, sequence, and motive. Initial reports speculated wildly. Some said a domestic argument escalated, others pointed to mental health struggles, still others suggested financial disputes. But the official record is clear. Rob and Michelle died on Sunday, December 14th, and the method was violent, deliberate, and shocking. The questions, however, are far from settled. What triggered the attack? How did it unfold? And perhaps most importantly, why did it happen at all? These are the questions that have gripped the public imagination and that Nick Reiner now begins to answer. But in doing so, he opens a door to even more unsettling revelations. Public fascination with this story is understandable. We are drawn to celebrity tragedies because they juxtapose extraordinary privilege with the raw vulnerability of human life. But it's not just the fame that hooks us. It's the psychology, the mystery, the human drama. How does someone who grew up in the lap of luxury, who knew love and attention from their parents, end up implicated in the deaths of those same parents? And how do the other family members navigate this surreal, horrifying reality? These questions aren't rhetorical. They are the lenses through which we will examine every twist, contradiction, and revelation over the course of this video. To fully understand what happened, we need to step back and explore the context, the relationships, and the tensions that preceded December 14th. Nick Reiner's upbringing, his relationships with his siblings, and his interactions with his parents all form pieces of a puzzle that is as complicated as it is disturbing. We will explore not only what happened on that night, but also the underlying factors, emotional, financial, and psychological, that may have contributed to the tragedy. Every detail matters, from the architecture of the estate to the timing of movements that night, from statements given to the police to the conflicting reports circulating in media coverage. Each element is a thread in a tapestry of chaos, tension, and tragedy. And yet, despite the horror, the confusion, and the media frenzy, there are moments that reveal the humanity at the center of this story. Rob Reiner's courage, the shock and disbelief of neighbors, even the private struggles of Nick himself. All of these are part of a narrative that is deeply human, even as it is terrifying. Our goal in this video is not merely to recount events, but to make sense of them, to explore the contradictions, and to uncover the truths that have been obscured by rumor, speculation, and incomplete reporting. Along the way, we will ask uncomfortable questions, confront difficult truths, and probe the psychological and emotional dimensions of this tragedy. So, why does this story matter now? Because it is unfolding. Because Nick Reiner has spoken, and what he reveals challenges everything we thought we knew. Because families, even those that appear perfect, can harbor chaos beneath the surface. Because the questions raised about trust, love, violence, and morality resonate far beyond the gates of a single Brentwood estate. And because as we dig deeper into this case, the contradictions, surprises, and emotional shocks keep coming, demanding our attention and defying our expectations. By the end of this video, you will have a deeper understanding not just of what happened to Rob and Michelle Reiner, but of the chaotic forces that shaped that night, the family dynamics that played into it, and the shocking revelations Nick has shared. But before we dive into the chapters, consider this. Even the most meticulously crafted public lives can conceal private chaos. Even the most loving family can harbor tensions that explode unexpectedly. And even the clearest narrative can be turned on its head by the words of someone at the center of it all. So brace yourself, because the night of December 14th was far more chaotic, far more confounding, and far more shocking than anyone outside the estate could have imagined. With a question that grabs attention immediately: what does it mean to grow up in the shadow of Hollywood royalty? Rob Reiner was more than just an actor or director. He was a living icon, a figure whose name alone carried weight in an industry obsessed with success and legacy. From classics like This Is Spinal Tap to blockbuster hits and beloved television appearances, Rob built a career that seemed invincible. But fame has its price. Public admiration can mask private turmoil. And the Reiner family, despite its wealth and status, was no exception. To understand the events of December 14th, we must first understand the family's history. Rob and Michelle's marriage, by all appearances, was a model of Hollywood stability. Their children, Nick, Romy, and Tracy, were raised in a world of privilege, surrounded by opportunity, guidance, and love. But wealth and fame are double-edged. They create expectations and pressures that most outsiders cannot imagine. A family can appear perfect in public while hiding tensions, resentments, and secrets in private. Every glance, every word, every unspoken argument can accumulate, creating a simmering pressure cooker. Nick Reiner grew up under the intense scrutiny of a world that both adored and envied his father. He lived in a household where accomplishments were expected, where the bar was set impossibly high, and where every action could be judged. And yet, like many children in famous families, Nick was more than just an heir to a legacy. He was an individual with his own struggles, emotions, and frustrations. The complexities of sibling relationships, parental expectations, and personal ambition often collide in families, but in the Reiner household, those collisions were magnified by wealth and attention. Tracy Reiner, the older sibling, navigated her own path through Hollywood, balancing familial loyalty with her own career ambitions. Romy, the youngest, was reportedly closer to her parents in terms of emotional dependence, yet she too observed the dynamics that many outside the estate would never see. These relationships are important because they provide context for the tragic events that would later unfold. Understanding the Reiners' family dynamics is not merely gossip. It is essential to understanding why a night of chaos could erupt in a home that outwardly seemed harmonious. But even as we examine these relationships, contradictions emerge. Public appearances painted a picture of unity, laughter, and togetherness. Family photos, social media posts, interviews, all projected a curated version of domestic bliss. Yet those closest to the family hint at tensions, arguments, and unresolved grievances that simmered beneath the surface. The question becomes, were these tensions explosive waiting to happen, or were they the kind of small, manageable conflicts that exist in all families? And if they were explosive, what exactly triggered the eruption on December 14th? The Reiner estate itself is a symbol of their status and the environment in which these dynamics played out. Nestled in Brentwood, a neighborhood synonymous with wealth and celebrity, the $13.5 million property was more than a home. It was a stage. Luxurious, spacious, and meticulously maintained, it represented success. But within its walls, privacy and security were double-edged. Guests were observed, movements were tracked, and the division between public image and private life was carefully managed. The guest house, where Nick lived, was a physical manifestation of that separation, close enough to family for proximity, yet separate enough to foster autonomy, independence, and perhaps resentment. Resentment is a subtle but critical element. Children of prominent families often grapple with feelings of inadequacy, comparison, or unspoken competition. Was Nick burdened by expectations he could not meet? Did he feel misunderstood, overlooked, or confined within a world designed for perfection? These questions may not provide immediate answers, but they illuminate the emotional landscape that contributed to the chaos of December 14th. The public, of course, had little insight into these subtleties. They saw headlines: a famous couple murdered, a son arrested. They saw speculation, rumors, and fragmented reporting. But what the media could never capture was the texture of family life, the quiet arguments, the private frustrations, the moments of love and conflict that define every household. Those details matter because they are the threads from which tragedy is woven. Understanding these dynamics is not about assigning blame. It is about comprehending how a chain of events, however unexpected, could escalate beyond control. Rob and Michelle themselves were complicated figures. Rob's career demanded charisma, creativity, and attention to the world around him, while Michelle's life was often framed by the support of her husband's ambitions and the care of their children. Their parenting styles, their interpersonal dynamics, and their handling of conflict would all play into the events of that night. Was there a disconnect between intention and perception? Did they underestimate the potential for violence or emotional breakdown? These are questions we will explore in later chapters, but even here, the seeds of curiosity are planted. One cannot discuss the Reiner legacy without touching on media influence. Fame distorts perception, both for those inside the family and those outside. Nick, living under the shadow of a celebrity father, was constantly aware of how actions could be interpreted, sensationalized, and misunderstood. This awareness can create pressure, anxiety, and a sense of isolation. It can magnify conflicts that would be trivial in a more ordinary household. It can also create a stage for events to spiral out of control, because every word, every decision carries heightened significance. And yet, even with these pressures, it is important to recognize that tragedy is never inevitable. Many families navigate fame, wealth, and complexity without resorting to violence. The question, then, becomes not why the Reiners had conflicts, but what made this particular night, December 14th, a breaking point. Understanding the family dynamics provides context, but the chaos that unfolded cannot be explained by context alone. It requires a detailed examination of timing, relationships, and individual decisions, a puzzle we will begin to piece together in the chapters to come. Despite the complexity, there are patterns. Family tragedies often follow recognizable emotional and psychological arcs. Tension builds, miscommunication escalates, triggers set off reactions, and normal routines fracture into disorder. In the Reiner household, these patterns were intensified by proximity, history, and emotional investment. Nick's perspective, which he has begun to share, sheds light on how those patterns culminated in violence. His words, while shocking, provide critical insight into the moments that led to murder and chaos. Even in recounting history, contradictions abound. Public statements, police reports, and family accounts frequently diverge. Romy's initial observations, for example, suggest an immediate awareness of danger, while other sources describe confusion and delay. These contradictions are not anomalies. They are intrinsic to human experience, especially in high-stress, high-emotion environments. They challenge us to question assumptions, to resist oversimplification, and to remain attentive to detail. And then there's the psychological aspect. Understanding Nick's mental and emotional state is central to understanding the events that transpired. Like many adults living under extreme pressure, he likely experienced a mix of frustration, fear, and confusion. His confession, that nothing happened the way people think, is both a statement of fact and a plea for understanding. It invites us to reconsider initial narratives, to think critically about motive and sequence, and to explore the gap between perception and reality. Finally, as we reflect on the Reiner legacy, one thing is clear. The public image of a family, no matter how polished, cannot fully capture the reality of human relationships. Beneath every curated appearance lies a network of emotions, histories, and tensions that can erupt when least expected. The story of December 14th is a stark reminder of that truth. It is also a story that demands careful attention, curiosity, and empathy, because the human cost is profound and the lessons are many. By the end of this chapter, we begin to see not just the surface-level details of a famous family, but the emotional and psychological undercurrents that made a night of chaos possible. The stage is set for the tragic events to follow. But even as we examine the legacy, the wealth, and the dynamics, the question lingers: how did this seemingly perfect family life unravel so catastrophically? And what role did each member play in the chaos that night? The answers are coming. But the first shocking revelations await in the timeline of December 14th, where routine turned into nightmare. Started like any other Sunday in Brentwood. The sun rose over the city, casting its usual golden glow across the manicured lawns, quiet streets, and the sprawling estates of the city's elite. But for the Reiner family, that day would mark a turning point so violent, so shocking, that its impact would reverberate far beyond the gates of their $13.5 million home. The events of that day would forever change the public perception of Rob and Michelle Reiner, their children, and the very notion of what can happen behind closed doors in a household that seems perfect from the outside. In the early hours, life appeared normal. Rob Reiner, the celebrated director and actor, followed his usual routine: breakfast, morning calls, perhaps a brief walk on the estate grounds. Michelle, attentive and organized as always, prepared for the day ahead, tending to household matters and checking in on the family. Meanwhile, Nick Reiner, 32, living in the guest house on the property, began his day with routines that likely seemed ordinary to him but would, in hindsight, take on eerie significance. Romy, 27, the youngest child, and Tracy, older sibling and sometimes observer of family dynamics, also moved through their Sunday, unaware that the hours ahead would erupt into chaos. But beneath the veneer of a routine Sunday, subtle signs hinted at tension. Witnesses, neighbors, and family accounts paint fragments of a day marked by unease, disagreements, and quiet frustrations. Some sources suggest minor arguments occurred earlier in the day, though details are murky and conflicting. Was it a disagreement over family finances, household management, or personal boundaries? The specifics may never be fully confirmed, but the presence of tension is undeniable. What seems trivial in isolation, raised voices, curt words, or a slammed door, can, when compounded with complex emotions and unspoken resentments, set the stage for tragedy. By midday, the Reiners' estate, typically a hub of controlled order and privilege, began to show the subtle signs of unrest. Nick Reiner, reportedly in the guest house, was engaged in his own activities, possibly preparing for a private project or simply seeking solitude. Meanwhile, Rob and Michelle moved through their home, managing tasks and attending to their personal routines. But as the afternoon approached, the household, intentionally or not, began to fracture along invisible fault lines. What would later be described as chaos was quietly germinating. The timeline of events that day is critical, yet frustratingly incomplete. Reports suggest interactions among family members were tense, but not overtly violent until later. The moments that preceded the attack are clouded by contradictions, inconsistencies, and gaps in recollection. Romy's account, for example, indicates that she observed unusual behavior and sensed danger even before the tragic climax. Her intuition, acute and immediate, may have been one of the first alarms of the storm that was about to descend. By late afternoon, something shifted. The quiet tensions escalated into conflict, though the specifics remain debated. Some sources point to a verbal argument between Nick and his parents, others to emotional volatility stemming from long-standing frustrations. What is clear is that the household's equilibrium collapsed. The boundaries between ordinary conflict and extreme violence were crossed in a matter of hours, or even minutes. Neighbors reported unusual sounds from the estate that day, though these reports are often contradictory. Some claimed they heard nothing out of the ordinary until emergency services arrived. Others mentioned distant shouting or hurried movements within the property. In many ways, these observations underscore a central theme of the Reiner tragedy. Appearances can be deceiving. Even within a home filled with chaos, the world outside can remain oblivious, highlighting the stark contrast between public perception and private reality. As evening approached, the tension reached its breaking point. The precise sequence of events is partially reconstructed through police reports, forensic evidence, and, most importantly, Nick Reiner's later statements. These sources suggest a series of confrontations, each escalating in intensity, culminating in the horrific attack that claimed the lives of Rob and Michelle. According to official reports, the deaths were caused by multiple sharp force injuries, the method leaving no ambiguity about the deliberate and violent nature of the crime. The timing of these injuries, alongside physical evidence found in the estate, allows investigators to piece together a rough chronology, though gaps and contradictions remain. One critical figure that evening was Romy Reiner. As the youngest child, she reportedly discovered the bodies, an event that has been described as both traumatic and pivotal. Her observations immediately drew attention to a dangerous family member, Nick, and set in motion the chain of events that led to his arrest. Romy's awareness, quick thinking, and courage under unimaginable stress highlight the human dimensions of this tragedy. She did what she could in a chaotic, horrifying situation, yet the emotional toll on her and other family members would be profound and lasting. While the immediate focus has often been on the moment of violence, it is important to understand the context. This was not a spontaneous eruption of fury, but rather a culmination of complex family dynamics, long-standing tensions, and emotional pressures. Each argument, each minor confrontation, each frustration throughout the day contributed to the conditions that allowed chaos to manifest. When Nick later stated that nothing happened the way people think, he was emphasizing that the events were not linear, not predictable, and not easily understood from outside the household. The night did not follow a clear, rational sequence. It was messy, unpredictable, and, above all, terrifying. By the time law enforcement arrived, the scene they encountered was stark, horrifying, and difficult to interpret. Bodies were found in positions suggesting struggle, and physical evidence indicated that multiple points of contact and force were involved. The brutality of the scene, combined with the chaotic environment of the estate, made immediate interpretation challenging. For investigators, the task was to reconstruct events from fragments, blood spatter patterns, furniture displacement, witness statements, and, crucially, the accounts of those present in the home, including Romy and, later, Nick. The importance of timeline reconstruction cannot be overstated. Understanding who was where, when, and in what state of mind is essential to understanding motive, method, and sequence. Small details. A door left open, a phone call unanswered, a gesture misinterpreted, take on outsized significance in the aftermath of tragedy. They provide clues that can confirm or contradict narratives, and in a case as complex and emotionally charged as this, they are vital for uncovering the truth. Despite the chaos and horror, glimpses of human behavior shine through. Romy's immediate concern for safety, her recognition of danger, and her decision to alert authorities demonstrate remarkable composure in the face of trauma. Similarly, neighbors' reports of seeing the aftermath or of noticing unusual activity contribute to a broader understanding of how events unfolded beyond the estate's gates. These perspectives remind us that tragedy is not experienced in isolation. It reverberates through communities, creating ripples of shock, confusion, and grief. The final hours of December 14th are marked by a mixture of clarity and confusion. Nick Reiner's eventual arrest was based on a combination of evidence and witness accounts. Yet even as law enforcement took decisive action, questions remained. How did events escalate so rapidly? What role did long-standing tensions play versus the immediate triggers of that day? And how do we reconcile conflicting reports, witness accounts, and forensic findings into a coherent narrative? These questions frame the chapters that follow, guiding us into the crime scene itself, where evidence begins to tell a story far more complex than headlines suggested. By tracing the day's events in detail, we start to see patterns emerge: escalating arguments, emotional volatility, and moments of fear and confusion. But the most critical point remains that the chaos of December 14th cannot be reduced to a single cause or moment. It was the convergence of multiple factors: family dynamics, personal struggles, environmental pressures, and emotional triggers that culminated in tragedy. The day itself becomes a character in the story, shaping, directing, and amplifying the actions that would unfold that night. As night fell over Brentwood, the estate transformed from a symbol of wealth and security into the site of a horrific, disorienting crime. The ordinary routines of breakfast, chores, and quiet conversation were replaced by panic, violence, and terror. What had started as a normal Sunday deteriorated into a night that no one inside the estate could have anticipated or controlled. And yet, within that chaos, moments of human response, bravery, and confusion emerged, fragments of a story that, pieced together, reveal both the horror and the humanity at the center of this tragedy. But what came next? The discovery of the bodies, the police investigation, and the shocking details of the crime scene would expose contradictions and revelations that no one expected. The crime scene at the Reiner estate was unlike anything the responding officers had encountered in their careers. A sprawling $13.5 million Brentwood mansion, normally a symbol of wealth, security, and celebrity prestige, had become a site of unimaginable horror. Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle Reiner, 70, were found stabbed multiple times, their deaths immediately classified as homicide. For the investigators, the challenge was not just the brutality of the scene, but the chaos that permeated every corner of the property. Nothing was in its expected place. The air was thick with the echoes of struggle, panic, and despair. When police first entered the home, they were confronted with a scene that suggested confusion and disorder. Furniture had been displaced, objects were broken, and traces of a violent struggle were evident throughout several rooms. Blood spatter patterns, critical to reconstructing the sequence of events, indicated multiple points of attack and suggested that the victims had tried to defend themselves. Yet the evidence was contradictory in places, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. What happened first? Where did the confrontation begin? How could a family living under one roof descend into such chaos? One of the first challenges in interpreting the crime scene was separating fact from speculation. Media reports flooded the airwaves within hours of the discovery, often conflicting and sensationalized. Some sources suggested a premeditated act, others portrayed the attack as impulsive a sudden eruption of violence. Yet the forensic evidence, precise as it could be in the middle of chaos, pointed to a night of disorganized, frenzied activity. Multiple sharp force injuries to both Rob and Michelle indicated sustained attacks, but the exact sequence remained unclear. The scene suggested a combination of targeted strikes and chaotic struggle, consistent with Nick Reiner's later description that nothing happened the way people think. Key elements of the crime scene demanded particular attention. The bedrooms, often the most private spaces in a home, bore the marks of conflict. Personal items were scattered, clothing was disturbed, and there were signs that the victims had attempted to shield themselves. Investigators noted the presence of defensive wounds on both Rob and Michelle, indicating that they fought back, even as the violence escalated. These details provide critical insight into the terror of that night, illustrating a scenario of desperation, fear, and unimaginable panic. The layout of the estate itself further complicated the investigation. With multiple wings, a guest house, and expansive grounds, the Reiner property offered both access and isolation. Nick Reiner lived in the guest house, separate from the main home, yet close enough that interactions were frequent. Understanding movement within this space was essential to reconstructing the events. Surveillance cameras, if any, were reportedly limited, leaving forensic evidence, witness accounts, and statements from those present as the primary sources for investigators. Every doorway, hallway, and stairwell became a potential point of analysis, each offering subtle clues about the progression of violence. Romy Reiner, the youngest daughter, played a crucial role in the early stages of the investigation. According to reports, she discovered the bodies and immediately informed authorities about a dangerous family member who should be considered a suspect. Her observations were critical, not only because they led to Nick Reiner's arrest, but also because they highlighted the initial confusion and emotional shock experienced by family members. Romy's account added nuance to the scene, emphasizing that the chaos was not just physical but emotional, a complex interplay of fear, grief, and disbelief. Investigators also focused on forensic details that would help reconstruct the night. Blood spatter patterns, wound trajectories, and the positioning of the bodies suggested a sequence of attacks that was far from linear. Furniture and personal effects provided additional context. Overturned chairs, broken picture frames, and displaced items indicated struggle, movement, and panic. Every piece of evidence was a fragment of a larger story, a story that had to be pieced together with painstaking care. One of the most perplexing aspects of the crime scene was the contradiction between the apparent level of chaos and the presence of moments that seemed strangely ordered. Certain items were left untouched, and some areas of the estate appeared minimally disturbed. These inconsistencies puzzled investigators and added to the growing sense that the events of that night were chaotic yet interspersed with moments of unexpected behavior. They also reinforced Nick's statement about the night being far from what anyone imagined, suggesting that assumptions based on appearances could be dangerously misleading. Another critical element was the proximity of the guest house. Nick's living quarters allowed him to be near the main house while maintaining separation. This spatial arrangement became a focal point for investigators trying to understand how interactions unfolded. Movement between buildings, the timing of confrontations, and the location of attacks all factored into the forensic reconstruction. The estate itself became a character in the narrative, shaping the events, constraining actions, and influencing outcomes in ways that were subtle yet profound. The physical evidence, however, was only part of the story. Investigators had to contend with emotional and psychological dimensions. The shock experienced by Romy upon discovering the bodies, the presumed state of panic of Nick during and after the events, and the trauma endured by anyone present. Understanding behavior in high-stress situations is complex, and it became a crucial element in interpreting the scene. What choices were made in moments of extreme fear? What reactions were instinctive, and which were calculated? These questions would continue to surface as the investigation unfolded. Adding further complexity were the conflicting reports from initial witnesses and neighbors. Some described hearing nothing unusual. Others claimed to have heard shouting, movement, or even a struggle. These accounts, when compared with forensic evidence, highlighted the difficulty of constructing a reliable narrative from fragmented observations. Yet each piece of testimony added texture, helping to create a more comprehensive understanding of how the night unfolded. The discovery of multiple sharp force injuries underscored the severity and deliberate nature of the attack. Investigators classified both deaths as homicide, with the injuries indicating a sustained and targeted assault. Yet, the chaotic layout of the scene, combined with contradictory witness accounts, created ambiguity about the exact sequence of events. Did the attack begin in one room and spread to another? Did the victims attempt to flee, or were they confined to specific areas? These questions remain central to understanding the events of that night. Every detail mattered, from the smallest trace of blood to the positioning of objects in hallways. Investigators approached the scene methodically, documenting, photographing, and analyzing each element. But even with modern forensic techniques, the complexity of human behavior, emotional volatility, and environmental variables created a scenario that resisted easy interpretation. It was, in every sense, a puzzle built from fragments of terror, confusion, and violence. And yet, despite the chaos, patterns began to emerge. Investigators could trace movement through the estate, reconstruct moments of confrontation, and establish timelines for the attack. Each new discovery raised further questions about motive, intent, and opportunity. Who acted first? How did the struggle evolve? And crucially, how does this physical evidence align with statements provided by family members, especially Nick Reiner? The crime scene at the Reiner estate thus became both a location and a narrative. It told a story of fear, struggle, and death, but it also raised profound questions about family dynamics, intent, and chaos. As forensic teams worked to piece together the sequence of events, one overarching theme became clear. This was not a simple case of anger or premeditation. It was a night defined by unpredictability, conflicting motives, and emotional turmoil, a night where nothing happened the way anyone imagined. The next chapter of this story, Nick Reiner's arrest, the police investigation, and the shocking details of his own account, would bring these findings into sharper focus. Evidence alone could not explain the human decisions, the emotional breakdowns, or the psychological triggers that had led to this tragedy. Those insights, revealed in the hours and days after December 14th, would transform the investigation from a forensic puzzle into a gripping human drama, one that continues to unfold. The night of December 14th did not end with the discovery of Rob and Michelle Reiner's bodies. In many ways, it was only beginning. As law enforcement officers combed the sprawling Brentwood estate, trying to piece together the chaotic events, a chilling realization emerged. The primary suspect was not an outsider, not a burglar, not a random intruder. It was someone who lived within the walls of the estate. Nick Reiner, 32, the son who had spent years in the shadow of his famous father, suddenly became the focus of a high-profile criminal investigation. The arrest of Nick Reiner sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, social media exploded with speculation, and ordinary citizens struggled to reconcile the image of the young man they thought they knew with the allegations against him. How could a son be accused of killing both parents? Was this premeditated, or a moment of uncontrollable rage? And perhaps most importantly, what had truly happened that night? According to reports, Nick was taken into custody at the estate, where he had been living in the guest house. Officers approached carefully, aware that the situation involved a high-profile family and a suspect who had been inside the house during the murders. There were questions about whether he was cooperative, whether he understood the gravity of the situation, and how the emotional and psychological stress of the moment affected his behavior. Witness accounts suggest a mixture of confusion, fear, and shock on Nick's part, but the official narrative focused on the legal and procedural aspects of the arrest. The media coverage of Nick's arrest was intense and often sensationalized. Headlines emphasized the shocking nature of the crime, the prominence of the Reiner family, and the seeming impossibility that a son could be implicated in such a horrific act. Some stories suggested motive, pointing to potential financial disputes or personal conflicts, while others framed the incident as an inexplicable tragedy, a sudden eruption of violence in a family that seemed outwardly normal. These reports, while capturing public attention, often glossed over the complexity of the situation, the nuance of family dynamics, and the chaotic sequence of events that Nick would later describe. As Nick was escorted into police custody, investigators continued to examine the estate, trying to reconstruct a timeline and understand the interactions that had led to the murders. Every detail mattered: the placement of furniture, the presence of defensive wounds, the trajectory of blood spatter, and the statements from Romy and other witnesses. Nick's proximity to the main house, his knowledge of its layout, and his interactions with his parents and siblings all became focal points in understanding opportunity, intent, and sequence. Despite the formal procedures of arrest, the human drama of the moment was undeniable. Family members were in shock, neighbors were stunned, and law enforcement officers were confronted with the emotional intensity of a domestic tragedy turned violent. Romy, having discovered the bodies, grappled with disbelief and grief, while Tracy Reiner faced the complex position of navigating familial loyalty, public scrutiny, and her own understanding of what had occurred. The psychological weight of these dynamics added layers of complexity to what was already a highly sensitive investigation. Nick's own statements during the initial questioning would later reveal fragments of his perspective. He described the night as chaotic, disorganized, and overwhelming, emphasizing that events did not follow a linear or predictable pattern. These comments provided insight into his state of mind, though they also introduced ambiguity. Was he attempting to explain, justify, or mitigate his actions? Or was he conveying the genuine confusion and panic that characterized the night? Investigators and the public alike were left to interpret his words, weighing them against physical evidence, witness testimony, and forensic analysis. The arrest also raised immediate legal questions. Nick was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, a serious allegation that carried the potential for life imprisonment or even harsher penalties. The case quickly became one of the most high-profile criminal proceedings in recent memory, not only because of the Reiner's celebrity status, but also because of the shocking nature of the allegations and the complex dynamics involved. Legal analysts noted the challenges of assembling a case. The interplay of evidence, statements, motive, and intent would be scrutinized in unprecedented detail. Emotional responses to Nick's arrest varied. For some, it represented a betrayal of familial trust and love. For others, it underscored the fragility of human behavior under stress and the unpredictable consequences of emotional breakdowns. Romy, in particular, faced the dual role of grieving for her parents while navigating the reality that her brother was now a suspect in their deaths. Her courage and clarity during this time were notable, but the emotional toll was immense, leaving scars that would not easily heal. As the night progressed, investigators began to piece together additional details. Phone records, surveillance, if any, and movement throughout the estate provided insight into the sequence of events. Officers also examined the interactions among family members, seeking to understand how relationships and tensions may have escalated to violence. Every small observation, a door left open, a sound in the hallway, a sudden silence, became a critical element in reconstructing the chaos that had overtaken the household. The arrest of Nick Reiner, however, did not close the case. Questions remained about the involvement, knowledge, or possible complicity of other family members. Among those scrutinized was Tracy Reiner, whose position within the family and presence in the broader household raised questions about her awareness of events, potential actions, and the extent to which she may have known more than she revealed. These uncertainties fueled speculation, debate, and further investigation, laying the groundwork for the next chapter of revelations. In the aftermath of the arrest, the public grappled with disbelief, horror, and a desire for answers. How could a family so admired, so celebrated, harbor the conditions that allowed a night of violence to erupt? What had triggered Nick's actions, and how did the chaos unfold so rapidly? The arrest was only the beginning of a long and complex process, one that would involve legal proceedings, forensic analysis, psychological evaluation, and, ultimately, Nick's own confessions. The story of that night was far from complete. While the arrest provided a focal point for law enforcement, it also opened the door to questions about family dynamics, complicity, and hidden tensions. Romy's observations, Tracy's possible knowledge, and the chaotic sequence of events all demanded careful scrutiny. Each element contributed to a larger narrative, one that was as much about human behavior, emotion, and psychology as it was about crime and punishment. Tracy Reiner's name did not dominate headlines immediately after the tragedy. Yet as investigators dug deeper into the Reiner estate, her position within the family, her presence during key moments, and her potential knowledge of the events became impossible to ignore. The question that hung over her like a shadow was simple yet devastating. Did she know more than she let on? Was she merely a witness to an unimaginable crime, or did she play a role that has yet to be fully revealed? Tracy's connection to the events of December 14th is complicated by her history within the family. As the older sibling, she had a unique perspective on both Nick and the parents, Rob and Michelle. She witnessed interactions that outsiders could only speculate about, arguments that simmered under the surface, minor disputes that hinted at deeper resentments, and emotional patterns that would, on that fateful night, spiral into chaos. Understanding Tracy's role requires examining not just her presence in the household, but also her relationships, loyalties, and motivations. Some reports claim that Tracy acted in ways consistent with complicity. Others portray her as a shocked and grieving sibling, struggling to comprehend the incomprehensible. The contradiction between these accounts mirrors the chaos of the night itself. What seems obvious from one perspective can be completely misleading from another. For investigators, discerning truth from perception became a critical task. Every statement, every action, and every omission was scrutinized, because in cases of domestic violence and familial tragedy, subtle behaviors can carry immense significance. On the night of the murders, Tracy's movements remain partially documented but open to interpretation. Did she interact with Nick before or during the escalation? Was she aware of rising tensions that evening? Reports suggest she was present in the broader household, though not necessarily in the immediate vicinity of the initial confrontation. Yet even peripheral presence can imply knowledge, particularly in a household where familial bonds are strong and private conflicts are rarely hidden. Investigators also considered Tracy's history with her brother. Familial relationships, especially among siblings, are rarely linear or simple. Nick and Tracy's interactions may have ranged from camaraderie to conflict, and past incidents could provide context for understanding awareness, influence, or intervention, or the lack thereof, during the tragedy. While details remain scarce, investigators considered prior behavioral patterns as part of a psychological profile of the household that night. Public speculation about Tracy's role has been intense. Social media and news outlets have debated whether she was an accomplice, a passive observer, or simply a witness who was too shocked to act decisively. Some have argued that her Hollywood experience and maturity should have enabled her to intervene or alert authorities earlier. Others contend that emotional shock and trauma can paralyze even the most seasoned adult, especially when confronted with a sudden, violent event involving one's own family. Adding to the tension are the statements of Romy Reiner, the youngest child, who reportedly identified Nick as a dangerous family member upon discovering the bodies. Romy's account indirectly implicates Tracy, raising questions about what she knew, what she observed, and whether she had opportunities to prevent or mitigate the tragedy. This intersection of accounts underscores the complexity of familial dynamics. Perception, intention, and action are deeply intertwined, and separating one from the other is often impossible without clear, corroborated evidence. Forensic and investigative focus on Tracy's role extends beyond presence to potential knowledge of motive. Investigators explored whether she was aware of disputes, financial tensions, or emotional volatility that may have preceded the attack. Every phone call, text message, and conversation became a potential clue. While some information suggested that she was oblivious to specific triggers, other sources imply that she may have had insight into conflicts that were intensifying within the household. The ambiguity is striking and fuels ongoing debate among analysts, journalists, and the public. It is also worth noting the psychological dimension. In moments of extreme stress and trauma, human behavior is unpredictable. Tracy's reactions could range from denial to shock to inadvertent complicity simply by failing to act. Experts in domestic violence and familial crisis often highlight that witnessing violence within one's family can create a paralyzing conflict between loyalty, fear, and moral responsibility. In Tracy's case, the challenge was compounded by the proximity of the events, the unpredictability of her brother's actions, and the suddenness of the escalation. Yet, even as scrutiny intensifies, it is essential to distinguish between allegation and fact. While media coverage and public speculation have painted varied pictures of Tracy's involvement, concrete evidence remains elusive. Investigators must rely on physical evidence, documented interactions, and verified statements rather than conjecture. This distinction is crucial to avoid misinterpretation, particularly in a case where family dynamics are tangled and emotions run high. Despite the ambiguity, Tracy's role remains a focal point for understanding the night's events. Was she a silent witness who could not comprehend the unfolding horror, or did she play a more active role, knowingly or unknowingly? These questions are central to both the legal and narrative arcs of the case, because unraveling them provides insight not just into what happened, but why it happened the way it did. Moreover, Tracy's potential involvement touches on broader themes of trust, loyalty, and familial bonds. In families, especially those marked by intense pressure or wealth, members often navigate complex moral landscapes: when to intervene, when to remain silent, and how to protect oneself while protecting loved ones. Tracy's actions, or perceived inactions, invite reflection on these dilemmas, adding emotional depth to an already dramatic narrative. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement's focus on Tracy intensified. Interviews, corroborative statements, and behavioral observations were analyzed to determine whether she had knowledge of Nick's intentions or awareness of escalating danger. Her answers, demeanor, and emotional responses became part of a larger mosaic of evidence that investigators used to reconstruct the sequence of events. Every hesitation, contradiction, or affirmation carried weight. Yet, even as authorities pursued clarity, public fascination with Tracy's role grew. Social media threads, fan forums, and news commentaries debated whether she was complicit, ignorant, or somewhere in between. The public's need for certainty, for assigning blame, contrasts sharply with the complex reality. Family tragedies rarely follow clean, logical patterns. The interplay of loyalty, fear, emotion, and shock can create situations where actions, or inactions, cannot be easily judged. And while questions about Tracy's role persist, one fact remains undeniable. Rob Reiner, the youngest sibling, directly encountered the aftermath of the violence and immediately recognized danger. Her perspective provides a counterpoint to speculation about Tracy, highlighting the diversity of human responses to trauma. Romy's courage in reporting her brother as a suspect underscores the contrast between instinctive action and more measured, or paralyzed, responses from other family members. The scrutiny of Tracy Reiner sets the stage for understanding the broader family dynamic during the tragedy. It emphasizes that this was not a simple crime of passion, but a multi-layered event involving human psychology, relationships, and unpredictable behavior. The question of complicity is intertwined with questions of perception, morality, and emotional response, all of which contribute to the complexity of the case. Rob Reiner's experience on December 14th is perhaps the most harrowing and emotionally charged of the entire tragedy. At just 27 years old, she became the first person to confront the aftermath of a night that would shatter her family forever. While the world speculated about motives, suspects, and the chaos that had unfolded inside the Reiner estate, Romy bore witness to the raw, unfiltered reality, a reality that no media outlet could capture in full. Her perspective provides both a human anchor to the story and critical insight into the events of that night. The discovery of her parents' bodies was not the result of searching or suspicion. It was a sudden, horrifying confrontation with death. According to accounts, Romy entered the home and immediately sensed that something was deeply wrong. The atmosphere was heavy with the lingering traces of violence, displaced furniture, scattered personal items, and the unmistakable smell of blood. Her instincts, sharpened by fear and familiarity, told her that this was no accident. Something catastrophic had occurred, and her parents were at the center of it. Romy's initial shock quickly gave way to clarity. Despite the emotional paralysis that any person would experience in such circumstances, she recognized the urgency of the moment. Her awareness of her brother Nick's potential involvement became the first critical decision point. She reported a dangerous family member to authorities, ensuring that law enforcement would focus on the person most likely responsible. This action, both courageous and instinctive, set the investigative trajectory and highlighted Romy's presence of mind under extreme duress. But the emotional toll of discovery cannot be overstated. Witnessing the aftermath of parental homicide is a trauma that leaves psychological scars, even for the most resilient individuals. Romy's immediate reactions, shock, disbelief, fear, and grief, underscore the human cost of domestic violence and family tragedy. Her courage in reporting Nick contrasts sharply with the paralysis that often accompanies trauma, emphasizing the range of human responses to extreme situations. The scene Romy encountered was chaotic and horrifying. Blood spatter indicated struggle, objects were overturned, signs of defensive action were evident. The forensic details, while critical to investigators, were secondary to the immediate emotional experience. The terror of realizing that the people she loved most had been brutally attacked, the uncertainty about whether anyone else in the household was in danger, and the overwhelming need to act decisively despite intense shock. Her response demonstrates the interplay between instinct and rational thought in life-and-death situations. Romy's observations provided investigators with crucial information. Her identification of Nick as a dangerous family member helped law enforcement focus on the primary suspect and avoid misdirection. In family homicides, immediate reports from those present are invaluable because forensic evidence alone may not reveal interpersonal dynamics, motives, or prior tensions. Romy's statement served both a practical and investigative function, highlighting the necessity of quick thinking in chaotic circumstances. The emotional complexity of Romy's role is staggering. She was grieving, terrified, and potentially facing the realization that her sibling might have been responsible for their parents' deaths. Navigating these conflicting emotions requires immense psychological resilience. Her capacity to act decisively in such conditions reflects not only courage but also an understanding of responsibility. She knew that alerting authorities promptly could save lives, prevent further chaos, and contribute to uncovering the truth. Romy's perspective also reveals the broader family dynamics that contributed to the tragedy. Her immediate identification of Nick as a potential threat suggests prior awareness of emotional volatility or tension within the household. This insight emphasizes that family history and personal knowledge can shape responses in critical moments, influencing both investigative outcomes and the unfolding narrative. In addition to emotional considerations, Romy's experience highlights procedural realities. Her presence, statements, and cooperation with law enforcement became integral to the investigative process. Investigators relied on her observations to reconstruct movement, sequence of attacks, and potential triggers. Every detail she provided, what she saw, heard, or sensed, was meticulously documented, forming a critical foundation for understanding the night's events. Yet even as Romy acted decisively, the psychological burden of witnessing parental homicide cannot be ignored. The trauma associated with such experiences often results in lasting emotional and cognitive effects, including flashbacks, anxiety, and difficulty processing complex information. Romy's ability to navigate these challenges while providing clear, actionable information underscores her extraordinary resilience. Her perspective also highlights the unpredictability of human behavior in crisis. While some individuals might freeze or retreat, Romy chose action, prioritizing the safety of others and the preservation of evidence. This contrasts with other family members' responses, ranging from shock to potential inaction, demonstrates the spectrum of human reaction under extreme stress. For investigators, Romy's account provided more than just a witness statement. It offered context, motive, and insight into familial relationships. Understanding how she perceived the night's events allowed law enforcement to triangulate her observations with forensic evidence, reconstruct timelines, and assess the credibility of other accounts, including Nick's own statements. Her perspective became a lens through which the chaos of December 14th could be analyzed with both emotional depth and procedural accuracy. Despite the horror, Romy's actions also reveal the presence of human agency in tragedy. Even in the face of unimaginable grief and fear, individuals can make decisions that influence outcomes, protect others, and contribute to understanding. Her courage, clarity, and decisiveness provide a stark contrast to the violence and confusion that define the night, emphasizing the complexity of human behavior in crisis. As we examine Romy's perspective, one fact becomes clear. The events of December 14th were not the result of a single decision or moment of anger. They were the culmination of family dynamics, emotional volatility, and chaotic escalation. Romy's experience illustrates both the immediacy of danger and the need for rapid, informed response, offering insight into how human perception and action intersect with forensic realities. The impact of Romy's actions would be felt immediately. Law enforcement's attention focused sharply on Nick Reiner, establishing him as the prime suspect and initiating a high-profile investigation. Her testimony, observations, and cooperation provided critical context for understanding the crime scene, the sequence of events, and the chaotic dynamics that led to the murders. But the story does not end with Romy's discovery. Her account sets the stage for deeper examination. The forensic evidence, the specific sequence of attacks, and the ways in which chaos, panic, and human decision-making converged to create a night of unparalleled horror. The Reiner estate had been secured, the bodies removed, and Romy's testimony had guided law enforcement toward the suspect. But understanding what happened on December 14th required more than witness accounts. It demanded meticulous forensic investigation. The chaos of the crime scene, the brutality of the murders, and the conflicting narratives made this process both crucial and exceptionally complex.